In 1979, I was 17 years old, and at that time I was introduced to Buddhist thought and meditation. And from the first week of being in that class, I was really compelled with the idea of giving my life to spiritual practice. And within a month of being in that class, I had a vision of wanting to live my life as a nun. And I also had a really deep-seated aspiration to go on pilgrimage to Southeast Asia and meet some of the meditation masters that I'd heard about. So in 1987, the conditions came together whether it was possible for me to go on this pilgrimage. And I quit my job as an analytical chemist, and I gave away all my belongings, including my car, and I found a loving home for my cat, Tasha. And I said goodbye to my family and my friends and my boyfriend. And I left on a one-way ticket by myself, and I landed in Kathmandu, Nepal. So I had been in Nepal for about 4 months, and the longer I stayed, the more agitated and unsettled that I became. It was the first time I'd been away from home by myself, and as a young woman in my mid-20s, it was unsettling. So I thought, well, what I really needed to do was head into the mountains, because for me, nature has always been a source of renewal and calm and centering. So I made my way through 125-degree heat in Delhi up into the foothills of the Himalayas and went to McLeod Ganj, which is above Dharamsala. And McLeod Ganj is the home of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. McLeod Ganj is the home of the Tibetan government in exile. And I was staying in a Tibetan guest house, and in this guest house was a young man my age, and I looked at him and he seemed trustworthy and honorable. I asked if he would like to join me on an overnight trip up into the mountains. And he said, sure. So we got our packs together and we made a picnic and we set out, and it was lovely. The temperature was cool and we ate wild strawberries on the way and enjoyed getting to know each other. And we made our way up to Triund, which is at a 10,000-foot saddle up above McLeod Ganj. And we put our packs down and we put our sleeping bags out and slept underneath the stars. Well, that night was 2 nights before the full moon in May. And the full moon in May is the most auspicious full moon in the Buddhist calendar. It commemorates the Buddha's birth, death, and enlightenment. It happened that that was a blue moon, that full moon, and it also happened that it was Brian's birthday. So we got up the next morning and left our big packs and made our way down this canyon towards a stream and enjoyed our picnic, and then made our way up this very steep bowl inside the mountain. And Brian came to a very large boulder and scrambled up, and I was still on the ground. He was asking if I could clamber up it, and I was standing there wearing sunglasses and saying, Brian, did you notice that there was a cave? And I couldn't see anything inside the cave because of my sunglasses. But before Brian could answer, out came this remarkable noise. It was a combination of a roar and a growl and a snort. And running at me incredibly fast from the distance of 6 feet away was this enormous black bear. And when the bear's face was 2 feet away from my face, several things happened all together in a very quick succession. I went for refuge, I screamed, I jumped, and I blanked out from fear. Now, going for refuge in the tradition that I come from is a way of aligning oneself with the awakened mind. It's a way of aligning oneself with the truth of the way things are, and it's a way of aligning oneself with all of the noble ones who have seen this truth and who live without fear or confusion. And when I came to, I could feel my whole belly pressed against a horizontal branch, and I could feel the weight of the bear pressing against the full length of my back. And I could feel him chewing on my head. That first moment of consciousness was absolute total, complete, unbounded fear. It had no edges to it. It had no space around it. It was pervasive. But right alongside this fear was the knowing of fear. And then the next moment of consciousness was the thought, well, there's no point in being afraid because you're going to die. And the knowing of the thought. I mean, it was pretty obvious to me this was not something I was going to be able to negotiate my way out of. And with that thought and the knowing of it, my mind and body just completely relaxed. And from being completely fear-stricken, I experienced no fear. The fear evaporated. And in its place was incredible curiosity and focused and interest, curious what it was going to be like to watch this mind and body dissolve. And there was this luminous joy. And the bear was still chewing on my head. Now, from that space came the sound of Ohm, which was quite a mystery because it was never something a part of my tradition. But nevertheless, the sound of Ohm welled up, and all I did was turn to focus on the sound. It was an internal sound. It wasn't an external sound. And the precise instant of the mind moving to turn to settle on the sound of Ohm, the bear left. Now Brian, who's on this rock, watching, desperate, panic-stricken, watching this nightmare unfold before him, he had seen the bear straddling me. I was totally invisible. He could not see any single part of me. And so by the time the bear left, what he noticed was the bear jumped over me with his arms and legs spread eagle, and then ran with its arms and legs spread eagle on its and slid on its belly for 15 to 20 feet before it regained its footing and ran away. And in an instant, he was down the rock and by my side, and he said to me, "You're not that badly hurt," which was such a kind thing to say. Just after being eaten by a bear. But the truth is, I had 7 gashes and wounds to my head and my neck and my face, and one of them at the base of my skull was 1.5 inches deep, but it hadn't actually penetrated my skull. So I said, "Brian, I'm going to be a little bit weird. You're going to have to look after me. Why don't you go find where we left our packs and come back and show me where the path was?" So he did, and I went and I lied down in the shade, and I was just overcome with this incredible feeling of blessing, but I had no language for it. I had no way of understanding it or describing why. So Brian found where our packs were, and he came back, and where we were was so steep, he couldn't help me climb out. We each had to climb ourselves, a foothold, a toehold. The leaf duff was very thick, and I remember each sound of footsteps and the leaves crunching. I remember the aroma of the earth. I remember the light streaming through the trees. I remember the bird song. The consciousness was pristine, so clear. So we made our way up to the packs, and to my amazement, Brian had the most amazing first aid kit of anybody I have ever traveled with, and had scissors and gloves and gauze and antiseptic and sorted me out, bandaged me up, and we walked down the 3 hours it took to get to the first place, which was the Tusita Institute. And they welcomed us and were incredibly caring and kind and called the Jeep to take us to the clinic. So the clinic was expecting a piece of hamburger to roll in through the door, and I walked in smiling and laughing. And they set about the business of antibiotic injections, the preliminary rabies injections, tetanus stitches, and when they had bandaged me up, I was lying on the cot. And by then, the bliss had started to wear off. And the pain was well and truly settling in, and I was trying to find a single place I could lean or rest my body, and there wasn't anything that didn't hurt. I felt like I'd been beaten up by a baseball bat. And I was lying on this cot, and the tears were just streaming down my face. And I remember thinking, there has got to be a reason in this world why I'm still alive. And I don't have a clue in the world what it is. So the next day, Brian and I made our way down to the Indian government hospital, which in some ways was an actually more difficult ordeal, because by then the delayed shock was well and truly settling in, and the bliss was way out of sight. And we had to get the actual rabies injection, which was extraordinary, but we prevailed. And then every day for 2 weeks, I needed rabies injections in my stomach. And then we traveled with the rabies injections, and I had boosters after that. And so Brian and I were traveling companions for 6 weeks, and then he went off to Pakistan and then back to his homeland in England. And I eventually went to Nepal. But one of the injuries on my head hadn't healed, and so I was staying in a guest house, and Nellie was there and had a whole bunch of pharmaceuticals, and so she cut me a deal. She said she would come and put on clean bandages, but if in a week I didn't heal, I had to go back into the clinic. So she kept her end of the bargain, and by the end of the week, I lost my end of the bargain, so both we went back into the clinic, and the attending physician took a cotton swab and stuck it into my head and pulled out a seed pod that had been lodged between the teeth of the bear. And so when that was removed, the injury eventually healed, and eventually I was well enough to make my journey to continue on, and I went to Thailand and visited monasteries there, and I was staying at Wat Pah Nanachat, which is the forest monastery of Ajahn Chah, one of the great forest meditation masters that I'd heard about in 1979. And while I was there thinking about everything that had happened and realizing that after hearing about stories of the bears, these bears were notorious for killing people, and recognized how fragile life was, and realizing that at that point, I really owed my life to the power of meditation. I really sensed that it was the capacity to stay present during that experience that was the reason why I was still alive. So it was a combination of seeing the power of meditation and the faith that the Buddha had first instructed, which is that if you're wanting to realize the fruits of meditation, there isn't a more powerful lifestyle than living as a monastic. So I decided to go forth and live as a nun, and went home to my family and friends and said hello and goodbye, and then made my way to England, where eventually I was part of the nuns community there and lived there for 20 years as a nun. And Brian came and visited me there several times. In 2009, I returned back to this country, and I came to Colorado Springs because my father was living here and his health was failing. And I wanted to be part of the family who are living here, the support and care of him, and to support him with his onward journey. And on August 1st, 2012, he passed. And 16 days later, I was in the Garden of the Gods, still feeling quite raw and sad and activated by some of the things that had happened as a result of his death and where it landed in me. And I was in the Garden of the Gods, sitting quietly and long enough to be still and peaceful and very grounded. And I heard footsteps. And I opened my eyes, and about 40 feet away was a juvenile she-bear. And she saw me, and she stopped, and she totally noticed that I was there, and I didn't see her as being aggressive. I just saw her as being incredibly curious. I was remarkably alert. But I wasn't frightened. I didn't have any fear. And where I was a place where about 7 of her could have walked past me without a problem. So I didn't anticipate there was going to be any problem. I expected her to walk right past me. But she didn't walk right past me. She walked right up to me with her face 10 inches in front of my face, with her eyes looking right into my eyes, exactly the same height as my eyes, and paused. And then she touched her nose to my knee. And when she actually physically made contact with me, she flipped out and in an instant bolted 40 feet and then clambered up the canyon walls with her eyes glued to me and walked past. And when she flipped out, I thought my heart was going to hit the tree that was 10 feet across the canyon. I couldn't believe how much my heart was racing. But right after she left, again, I felt this extraordinary blessing. So when I think about the first story, one of the things about that, which for me is really powerful, one of the reasons why I love that story, is because for most of us, most of our lives, we are completely committed to the idea that when we get what we want and we get rid of what we don't want, that's where we find peace and that's where we find happiness. But right in the middle of that story, with the bear chewing on my head, there was clarity, there was joy, there was peace. For me, the blessing of that story was not that I survived and that the bear left, but that by the time the bear did leave, I was going to be okay no matter what the outcome was. And for me, the power of the second story is that when we're able to attend to the traumas that we experience, the enormous fears that we have, and release them from our system and come into the present moment fresh, with eyes that are not conditioned by the past, we have the ability to receive the extraordinary intimacy that life has to offer. You see, in the first story, one of the things that had happened was that I was initiated into the bear clan. I became part bear. And in the second story, I was meeting one of my family.